But I was desperate enough to try. That is the average amount of time adults spend staring at screens every single day. 7 hours of notifications, headlines, emails, social media scrolls, and text messages competing for every fragment of attention we have left. Now multiply that by decades of habitual digital consumption, and what you get is not just distraction. What you get is a brain that has forgotten how to be quiet. For those of us over 50, the consequences are not just inconvenient, they are measurable. Researchers at the University of California found that chronic digital overstimulation in adults over 50 is directly linked to what neurologists are now calling chronic brain fog, a persistent state of mental cloudiness that disrupts memory, decision-making, emotional regulation, and sleep quality. The retreat center was a modest property about 2 hours outside the city, surrounded by pine trees and a small lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. There were 12 of us checking in that Friday afternoon, ranging in age from 32 to 67. We were handed a single sheet of paper outlining the rules. No speaking, no phones, no books, no journals, no music. Meals would be eaten in silence. Eye contact with other participants was discouraged to minimize nonverbal communication. The silence would begin the moment we surrendered our devices at the front desk. I handed over my phone like I was giving away a limb. The woman behind the desk placed it in a small labeled bag and smiled without saying a word. And just like that, it began. And the first thing I noticed walking to my room was how loud everything suddenly was. Birds, wind through pine needles, the sound of my own footsteps on gravel, sounds that had always existed but had been buried under the constant digital static I carried everywhere. For about 20 minutes, I felt something close to peace. Then the itch started. The anxiety was not rational, but anxiety rarely is. I sat with it. I had no other choice. I would be sitting on a wooden bench near the lake, and my right hand would drift toward my pocket before my conscious mind even registered the impulse. There was nothing there, of course, but the muscle memory was so deeply ingrained that my body kept searching for the device that was no longer present. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. Studies published in the journal Computers and Human Behavior have confirmed that smartphone use activates the same dopamine reward pathways as gambling and substance use. The anticipation of a notification, even a meaningless one, triggers a small but real neurochemical response. When that stimulus is removed abruptly, the brain registers something resembling withdrawal. By hour 6, I had mentally composed and discarded 14 emails I could not send. I had thought of 5 things I urgently needed to Google. I slept that night for 8 uninterrupted hours, the first time that had happened in longer than I could clearly remember. I woke before sunrise with a heaviness in my chest that I recognized as the anxiety I normally managed by immediately flooding my brain with information. Without that option, the feeling had nowhere to go. I sat in the small meditation hall as the sky outside the window shifted from black to deep blue to pale gold. I did not meditate perfectly. My mind churned through worries, regrets, half-finished thoughts, and random memories from decades ago. But here is what I noticed, and this is the part that surprised me most. Without the constant interruption of incoming information, my thoughts began to follow each other in sequence. One thought led to the next and the next, forming chains of reflection I had not experienced in years. I began to understand things about my own anxiety that no amount of scrolling had ever revealed. There is a specific quality to the silence that arrives on day 3 of a retreat that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It is not the absence of sound. The birds were still singing. The wind was still moving through the trees. It is the absence of internal noise. The mental chatter that most of us have accepted as the permanent soundtrack of our lives simply quiets down. On the morning of day 3, I sat by the lake for 2 hours without once wishing I were somewhere else or doing something else. That might sound unremarkable, but for a person who had spent years unable to sit through a 10-minute television program without checking their phone, it was extraordinary. My thinking had become cleaner, sharper, and more organized. Problems that had felt tangled and overwhelming when I arrived now appeared to have clear edges and possible solutions. A difficult conversation I had been avoiding with a family member suddenly seemed not only manageable but necessary and even welcome. Research from Harvard Medical School supports what I experienced. Extended periods of reduced sensory input allow the brain's default mode network to engage in deep consolidation, the process by which experiences, emotions, and information are integrated into long-term understanding. In simpler terms, silence gives the brain the space it needs to actually finish thinking. Reducing that exposure, even partially, measurably lowers baseline cortisol levels within 2 to 3 weeks, according to research published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology. 47 text messages, 62 emails, 11 missed calls. 3 days earlier, that list would have sent my heart rate spiking. Instead, I felt something I had not expected. Indifference. Not because the messages did not matter, But because I had spent 3 days rediscovering that my inner state was not dependent on what that screen contained. In the weeks that followed the retreat, my sleep improved dramatically. I was falling asleep faster, staying asleep longer, and waking without the immediate spike of cortisol that had been my morning companion for years. My anxiety did not disappear, but it changed in character. It became something I could observe and address rather than something that simply happened to me. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything you have been too distracted to hear. But you do need to take the noise seriously. Chronic brain fog is not an inevitable part of aging. It is, in many cases, a direct consequence of an overstimulated nervous system that has never been given permission to rest. The retreat did not give me anything I did not already have. It simply removed everything that had been covering it up. If the idea of 3 days without your phone sounds impossible, that reaction itself is worth sitting with. The things we cannot imagine giving up are often the things that have the most power over us. Start smaller, 1 hour of intentional silence in the morning.